you could see that real time on the ground where we were. And then, when you're in the chow hall, you can see the news that's covering it through, all of the media news channels, seeing the footage of where those munitions are being sent, the effects. So you're just you're compounding all of this information going, wow, we see where this is happening. We can smell it. We can see it. We can hear it. We're also seeing what's happening on the ground through television. And then as time progresses, when we did finally get, taken off the leash to go and do our part, when you started to get on the ground to see the effects of all of this, it was just for me, it's hard to put into words, the amount of damage that, war can do, not just on human life, but on infrastructure, the damage to the airfields, the buildings, all of that. So that was a bit of a way, I was wow, this is what war is. It's carnage. And that was a bit of an eye-opener for me, I guess.
You mentioned in terms of mentally preparing yourself, the conversations that you had with your family, the dawning of, this is not a peacekeeping mission, this is going to be more full on, this is actual war that I'm heading into. Did the mental expectation of what you thought it was going to be marry up with the reality when you were on the ground?
Kind of a two-part question. So I'll unpack the first part. There's a fair bit of sitting around, which I think that's an interesting or an important part to add to it in soldiering. There's a lot of, you're preparing your gear, you're anticipating what's to come. So that part, I kind of whitewashed that. I'm no, I'm always going to be in the thick of it. So that wasn't necessarily the case on that. The more the high tempo, the hypervigilance, that part's always there in the highs and the lows. And then the real intensive, the action parts, it's for me, and again, it's just me through my eyes, I was always, it felt like every couple of minutes, I'm questioning myself, is this real? Or am I dreaming? Is this some kind of fantasy? No, this is Andy, you're alive. You're you are seeing this real time. So there was always those reality checks for me. So that was interesting. I never really had that in my mental planning, when I was back in Australia preparing for combat operations.
Did you discuss that with any of the other guys that were over there? And were they also going through the same, is this real sort of self-conversations?
Not like the, hey, let's, sit around in a circle and drink a Coke and talk about it. Right. It was more the swear words of the in the moments. You see a strike fighter fly over your head at Mach 1 breaking the sound barrier, and you're just in awe, and you've got a few F-bombs getting thrown around, and just the theatrics.
You can swear on the podcast,
going,
Andy.
Oh man. Right. So just that in itself is kind of justifying to me, oh wow, they're seeing this the same way I am, without having the, hey, do you feel the same way I feel? Because the emotion, the raw body language kind of says it all.
How long was that deployment for?
We were over there, or I was over there a little bit longer. I was over, so about 4.5 months, because I stayed on a little bit longer after the main effort returned to like clean a lot of our equipment. You know, Australia's quarantine standards are a lot higher than everyone else's. So anything that was required to come back to Australia, you know, we went to a base over there, and, you know, we were going over stuff with a fine tooth comb, you know, making sure that it didn't have dust, you know, grass, whatever, so it could be returned to Australia and pass quarantine. So yeah, that was my last little, I guess, like 3 weeks of Iraq. And I thought it was awesome because it allowed me and the guys that I was with to like kind of decompress, because it was like, hey, you've been in a bit of unusual conditions. You can kind of reset your thermostat before you go back to, you know, do a load of laundry, go and pay the electric bill, go down and wait in line at, you know, to get your registration for your car. Like, it allowed me to like reset a little bit.
It's interesting because you don't really think about, well, as a civvy, you don't really think about having to clean a vehicle for quarantine standards to bring it back into Australia.
It was freaking painful. But, you know, the sun was out, we were getting tans, so, you know, I was sweet with it.
You mentioned that obviously the time to recalibrate and decompress because of the unusual setting of what you guys had obviously been through. And I use guys as a plural term in terms of that. I know that there was probably women attached to you guys as well. I use it as a unisex term, everybody.
Sure.
But what would you say was the most confronting aspect of that deployment that you weren't expecting?
I think, now I want to make it clear, I wasn't really involved in any like gunfights or battles in Iraq. So I hadn't really confronted that portion of my military career yet. But I did get confronted by the effects of war on humans. And what I'm talking about is the innocents that are caught in the middle. So there was the interaction of like the Iraqi civilians that were kind of like stuck in the middle. And that, I don't think, you know, for me, it was a little bit different to East Timor because you were dealing with the regular populace, but it wasn't at the capacity where, you know, people were getting blasted and, you know, houses are getting demolished and roads are being destroyed and personal property is being compromised. You didn't really have to deal with that at the capacity that you did in Iraq. So the part of soldiering where the compassion and sympathy narrative was kind of introduced to me for the first time. And I hadn't really felt like I'd been exposed to that up until then. So that was a part of my being that I kind of had to kind of interpret and figure out on the fly. So that was probably the most confronting part of Iraq, dealing with the community that was there to be, you know, picking up the pieces.